If the land could speak, what would it say about promises written, then erased by snow? Today we return to the Black Hills, a place once called Pahasapa, the heart of the world for the Lakota. What does it mean when a treaty becomes a ghost story? Tell me in the comments, do you think a nation can ever repair a broken promise to the land itself? December 29th, 1889. Pahasapa, the Black Hills, South Dakota Territory. The air was brittle, as sharp as shattered glass. Snow drifted in sheets over the sacred hills, burying the trails that once carried hunters and visions alike. From the cottonwood grove near White Clay Creek came the hollow thud of hooves, slow, deliberate, as if the horses themselves sensed what history was about to take away. In the distance, campfires flickered under a bruised sky, faint defiant sparks against the white silence. Women packed rawhide bundles. Men tightened the sinew on their bows, though they knew rifles now ruled the horizon. A boy dragged a sled lined with buffalo hide, his breath a cloud fading into the cold, one generation already learning to leave before dawn. On the ridge above them stood an army outpost, canvas tents, telegraph poles, and the uneasy rhythm of boots in snow. The soldiers' breath rose in the same frozen air, but their orders came from another world. A world of signatures, treaties, and gold veins running beneath the Black Hills. Beneath those hills, the Lakota believed slept the heart of the world, the breath of their ancestors, the pulse of creation itself. Now, the heartbeat was drowned out by the sound of hammers striking steel surveyors, marking what had once been promised forever. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, said these hills would belong to the Lakota as long as the grass grew and the rivers ran. But in this winter of 1889, the ink had already frozen, cracked, and bled into the snow. A single drumbeat echoed from a nearby lodge, steady, slow, like the earth, refusing to forget its own rhythm. Somewhere in the wind, the ghost dance began again. A prayer for renewal, a song for those who would soon vanish. History that night leaned over the frozen plains and began to redraw its maps. The treaties would break, and with them the line between faith and survival. The story of the Black Hills did not begin in blood. It began in ink. 2 decades before that frozen winter of 1889, the Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised the Lakota Sioux a homeland untouched, a vast sanctuary stretching across the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming. In return, they would lay down their arms, allow roads and forts to be built, and trust the government of the United States to honor its word. For a brief moment, it seemed peace had a chance. But history has a way of erasing lines faster than it draws them. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, by the very expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the treaty's sacred ink began to dissolve. Word of a mountain of gold spread through mining camps and saloons from St. Paul to San Francisco. Soon the Black Hills were crawling with prospectors, merchants, and claim seekers. They came with picks, rifles, whiskey, and greed, and behind them trailed the railroads, hungry to carve steel arteries through every wilderness that could feed a city. To the Lakota, the Black Hills Pahasapa were not just land. They were the navel of the world, the place where their creation stories began. Every ridge and river bend carried a name, a prayer, a memory. But to Washington bureaucrats and mining syndicates, the same hills were a ledger full of value, measurable only in dollars per ton. By 1877, the government declared the Black Hills ceded without the consent of 3/4 of the adult Lakota men, as the treaty required. That act was not just a betrayal. It was the legal fracture that began to split a continent. Across the Great Plains, U.S. policy turned from negotiation to assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided tribal lands into individual allotments, a strategy sold as civilizing but designed to dissolve communal life. Every family would be given a square of land to farm. Any surplus would be opened for white settlement. Overnight, the vast collective territories of nations like the Lakota were sliced into checkerboards. Ownership became isolation, and isolation became control. Meanwhile, military forts multiplied. Fort Meade, Fort Randall, Fort Bennett, their telegraph lines stitching together a new geography of command. Railways pressed westward carrying settlers, cattle, and soldiers. Diseases followed, as did traders and missionaries. By the late 1880s, buffalo herds were nearly gone. The backbone of Lakota survival, the great animal nations of the plains, had been annihilated for hides and sport. Starvation set in like an unrelenting season. Government rations promised by treaty arrived spoiled or not at all. Reports from Pine Ridge Agency recorded entire families living on boiled roots and scraps of flour mixed with snow. The once self-sufficient horsemen of the plains were forced to stand in line for handouts, their dignity shrinking with each empty sack of cornmeal. Politically, Washington called it progress, the march towards civilization. Economically, it was expansion, the extraction of land, minerals, and labor. But for the Lakota, it was dismemberment, every new law a scalpel, every survey line a wound. The missionary schools added another front to this silent war. Children were taken from their families, their hair cut short, their language forbidden. Letters from Indian agents boasted of remaking them in the white man's image. The memory of the hills of songs once sung beneath sacred peaks began to fade in young minds taught to forget. By 1889, the U.S. government proposed yet another division, this time splitting the Great Sioux Reservation into 5 smaller reservations: Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, and Lower Brule. Each division stripped away not just territory but mobility, the freedom to hunt, to roam, to remember. The land that had once stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon was now a cage of invisible borders. The pressure cooker was ready. Hunger, loss, betrayal, and a rising current of spiritual hope were all colliding. Among the Lakota whispers began to travel a vision of a song carried by the wind from the west, from the Nevada desert, where a Paiute prophet named Wovoka had seen a world renewed. In his vision, the earth would soon roll over like a great buffalo shaking its hide. The white men would vanish, the ancestors and the buffalo would return. It was a promise too bright to ignore, too desperate to resist. As the U.S. carved up the last of their lands, the Lakota turned inward, to faith, to memory, to ceremony. The ghost dance swept through the camps like fire through dry grass. It was not rebellion at first, it was hope. But to the officials at Pine Ridge and Standing Rock, it looked like war. And so, on the map of 1889, the lines began to tremble again. Between each reservation border and telegraph wire, between each hunger camp and fort wall, something ancient stirred the will of a people who had not yet accepted erasure. History was no longer written in ink. It was beginning to carve itself back into the earth. Her name in the records appears as Wichangpi We Star Woman. To the Indian Bureau, she was simply Sarah One Feather, age 28, Pine Ridge Agency. But among her people, she was known for the songs. She carried songs her grandmother said were older than the buffalo paths themselves. Star Woman had been born in the shadow of the Black Hills in the spring of 1861, when her father still hunted elk near the forks of the Cheyenne River. She had grown up during the Great Shift when the horizon filled not with buffalo but with soldiers' wagons. Her earliest memory was of a treaty meeting near the Little Missouri, white tents, blue uniforms, and her father's voice low and tight saying, "The paper will not hold the wind." By her teenage years, she had seen that truth unfold. The hunting grounds shrank, the forts multiplied, and the old life, the one her mother called the moving circle, was broken into fenced squares. Still, her family kept their small lodge by White Clay Creek. Her husband, Matto Two Knives, was a horse trader between the agencies, speaking both Lakota and English. His pocket sometimes heavy with silver coins, sometimes empty for months. They had 2 children, a boy of 7, a girl of 4, and a grandmother whose memory was fading like old smoke. Every morning that winter, Star Woman would grind cornmeal by the lodge fire, the sound of stone on stone, mixing with the wind outside. She wore a beaded belt her mother had given her, its pattern, showing the 4 directions protection from losing one's way. She still whispered the old prayers when the dawn came, even as the agency preacher told her it was sinful superstition. In November of 1889, when rumors of the ghost dance reached Pine Ridge, she was one of the first to listen. She heard that the Paiute prophet Wovoka had spoken of a world cleansed of hunger and sorrow, a world where the buffalo returned, and those who danced would see their loved ones again. She didn't think of rebellion. She thought of her father buried near the foot of Bear Butte, and how he had said the hills would breathe again when men remembered how to pray. Star Woman's want was simple and enormous. At once she wanted her children to grow up knowing the names of rivers, not the numbers of allotments. She wanted to keep the songs alive that the schools tried to erase. And she feared not death, but forgetting. The slow death that came when language itself was taken away. Her hands were rough from cutting hides, her nails lined with soot. She still kept a small pouch of sage tied at her waist for cleansing, for remembrance, for courage. It was the only inheritance she could still pass on without permission. When the agency agent ordered the ghost dance to stop, soldiers began to patrol the camps. Star Woman hid her ceremonial dress under her bedding, elk teeth sewn by her mother years ago, too precious to burn, too dangerous to wear. She knew the soldiers watched for the swirling dust of dancers, for the rhythmic drums that carried through the valleys at dusk. Through her eyes, the changing map of 1889 becomes personal. The broken treaties are not only about lines and laws, they are about the slow confiscation of sound, color, and belonging. Her husband said little, but she saw the fear in his jaw each time he returned from the agency with smaller rations. He feared the soldiers would come for the men first. She feared they would come for the children next. On the night when the first snow fell heavy across the plains, Star Woman sang to her children a lullaby forbidden in school books. Its words said, "The land listens when we speak softly." Outside, the drumbeat of the ghost dance carried faintly from another camp, a pulse answering her voice. In that rhythm, she felt something ancient stir the same defiance that had kept her people alive through smallpox, hunger, and exile. She did not think of politics nor of rebellion. She thought only, if I stop singing, the land will go silent too. Star Woman stands here at the center of our story, not a chief, not a warrior, not a saint, but a thread binding the past to the next breath. Through her, we hear what treaties cannot contain: the memory of land as kin and the refusal to let it die. And as the drums grew louder that winter, she began to believe maybe the earth itself was listening. December 1889. Pine Ridge Agency, Dakota Territory. The snow was already deep along White Clay Creek when the order arrived. The agent at Pine Ridge, Daniel Royer, newly appointed, nervous, barely acquainted with the people he was to manage, wired Washington in panic. His message read, "Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. We need protection. The employees and settlers are in danger." It was a single telegram, but it would move an army. That same afternoon, soldiers at Fort Robinson were told to prepare for winter patrols into Lakota country. Commanders at Fort Meade received identical instructions. The ghost dance was to be stopped by any means necessary. The words moved faster than the snow clouds, down telegraph wires, across frozen rivers, through iron lines of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway that carried troops west. For Star Woman and her family, the world shifted overnight. She awoke to the sound of riders galloping past her lodge agency police, Lakota men in blue coats deputized by the government to control their own people. One of them was her cousin's husband, a man who once danced beside her brother at a summer powwow. Now his coat bore brass buttons and a small badge stamped U.S. Indian Police. He shouted that no gatherings were allowed, that any ghost dancer caught outside the agency boundary would be arrested. She could see frost forming on his eyelashes as he spoke, a trembling mixture of shame and duty. By sundown, the hills that had echoed with drums fell silent. Camps broke apart. Families fled into the snow, heading west toward the stronghold, a high plateau in the Badlands, where they believed the soldiers would not follow. Star Woman's husband, Matto Two Knives, argued with her near the fire. He said they should go too before the scouts returned. The rations were cut again that week. The agent said supplies were diverted to more peaceful tribes. That night, they packed what little they could, carried dried meat, a small pot, a blanket for each child. The grandmother tied her medicine bundle to her chest. They left behind the corn mortar, the heavy stone too precious to lift a tool, her mother's hands had worn smooth years before. The trail toward the stronghold was lit by moonlight, white, windless, and silent, but for the crunch of snow under moccasins. Along the way, they met others' families from Red Cloud Agency, from Rosebud, from the scattered camps near White River. Some carried infants wrapped in robes, others pulled travois behind half-starved ponies. No one spoke loudly. The cold took the breath from every word. Behind them, the U.S. Army columns began to move. Captain Henry Glassford's reports note the dates: December 12th, troops dispatched to Pine Ridge. 350 men with Gatling guns and supply wagons. Officially, they were to observe the ghost dancers. Unofficially, they were to crush the movement before it spread. For Star Woman, the meaning was simpler. The soldiers were coming and the land was closing in. At the stronghold, hundreds gathered, ringed by cliffs of red stone. Fires dotted the plateau like fallen stars. Dancers began again, slow, rhythmic, unbroken by fear. They believed that with each turn the old world came closer. They sang of buffalo thundering back from the spirit plains, of rivers clearing, of ancestors rising to guide them. But each dance also sent more alarms eastward. To Washington it was sedition. To the Army, a threat of uprising. The telegraphs buzzed through the snow. Send more men, stop the dance, arrest Sitting Bull. And so the fuse was lit, a spark that would leap from one frozen camp to another, from the Standing Rock Agency to the stronghold, until it reached a small valley on the morning of December 29th, 1890, Wounded Knee Creek. For Star Woman's family, the moment of choice had come. Stay and risk arrest. Leave and face the cold. In the dark, as the wind rose and the drum beats echoed faintly from the plateau, she wrapped her children close and whispered the only thing she still believed: we will follow the songs even if they lead into the snow. That was the night the journey began, when faith became the last weapon left to those who had lost everything else. Tone-restrained sensory archival detail. Integrates documented triggers, Royer telegram, Indian police orders. Troop movement, and personalizes through Star Woman's immediate world. Leads naturally into P5 Set Piece 1 Intentions Terrain Turning Point. December 15th, 1890, Standing Rock Agency, Dakota Territory. Before the gun smoke and the frozen valley, before the names carved into marble, there was a single arrest order signed in ink, sealed with fear. U.S. Indian Agent James McLaughlin received it by telegraph. Proceed immediately to arrest Sitting Bull. He is to be taken dead or alive if he resists. The words came from Major General Nelson A. Miles, commander of the Division of the Missouri. To Miles, the ghost dance was not a ceremony. It was an uprising. To McLaughlin, Sitting Bull was the flame behind it. But the land around Standing Rock was not built for neat arrests. It was broken terrain, ravines choked with snow, cottonwoods bare and rattling in the wind, the frozen Missouri River gleaming like a blade. At dawn, the Indian police rode out from the agency. 39 men under Lieutenant Bullhead and Sergeant Red Tomahawk Lakota men, sworn to uphold the law of a government that had taken their own. They reached Sitting Bull's cabin at Grand River as the first light cracked over the plains. Inside, the Hunkpapa, Chief, was still asleep, wrapped in buffalo robes. His walls were lined with gifts from past visitors: a Winchester rifle, a saddle, a small painted drum. When they entered, he rose calmly, his voice steady. "What do you want?" Bullhead replied, "We have orders to take you." Outside, the snow squeaked under boots as a crowd began to form: men, women, dancers, followers. The air was brittle, every breath visible. The Indian police tried to lead the chief away quietly, but someone shouted, "They mean to kill him." The standoff broke like ice giving way. A shot cracked. No one later agreed who fired first. Bullhead fell mortally wounded, his rifle discharging as he dropped. The bullet struck Sitting Bull in the chest. He staggered once, blood on his coat, then collapsed beside his horse corral. Within moments, gunfire echoed through the camp. By the time the smoke cleared, 11 were dead, including the chief, his son, Crowfoot, and 6 policemen. The spark that had begun with a telegram now had its first bodies. News of Sitting Bull's death moved across the plains faster than the winter wind. Runners carried it south to Pine Ridge. "They have killed the chief. The soldiers are coming next." Panic spread through the ghost dance camps. Many fled toward the Badlands, the same high country where Star Woman and her family had sought refuge days before. There, geography became destiny. The stronghold was a natural fortress. Steep buttes rising from a sea of snow, narrow gullies leading to hidden plateaus. For centuries, it had been a sanctuary, a place of fasting and vision quests. Now, it was a barricade. Hundreds gathered in its heart, wrapped in blankets, stiff with frost, singing beneath a sky the color of iron. From the ridges, they could see the distant flash of soldiers' columns, the 7th Cavalry, once Custer's regiment, now reborn as enforcers of order. They advanced with wagons and field artillery, their movements slowed by ice and wind. Horses stumbled on frozen inclines. Wheels froze in the mud. What the army called a campaign was on the ground a struggle against the land itself. Inside the stronghold, the Lakota had no cannons, no rifles and plenty, only a handful of hunting weapons and belief. They watched the snow thicken, erasing their trails, turning the hills into ghosts of themselves. Some took it as a sign the earth was hiding them. Captain Glassford's reports from those days read like a man writing to convince himself they are in large numbers, armed and hostile. We will move when the weather allows. But the weather never truly allowed. The plains froze harder and food ran out. Star Woman's husband joined a scouting party one morning, hoping to find buffalo traces or even abandoned supply sacks along the river road. When he returned, his hands were raw and blue. He carried only 2 handfuls of frozen corn. The children's lips had turned white from hunger. Still, every night, the dancers gathered stamping feet into the snow until the rhythm replaced the sound of fear. Star Woman held her daughter in her arms as the circle moved, the fringe of the women's dresses flicking like sparks in torchlight. She saw one man fall in exhaustion, rise again, and whispered that he had seen a vision. The soldiers had vanished. The hills were green. The ancestors were walking among them. But vision did not stop the army's approach. By December 24th, Major General Miles received word that the ghost dancers were concentrated near Wounded Knee Creek on the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation. He ordered Colonel James W. Forsyth to intercept Chief Bigfoot, a Miniconjou leader bringing his band south seeking protection under Red Cloud. Forsyth moved with the 7th Cavalry, 470 men, 4 Hotchkiss guns, and winter rations for 10 days. Bigfoot's people were already weakened. Half of them sick, many barefoot, carrying the old and the young on travois through drifts waist-deep. On December 28th, they met the soldiers near Porcupine Creek. The commander demanded surrender. Bigfoot, burning with pneumonia, lifted his hands and said, "We are not fighting." The soldiers escorted them to a camp by the creek, promising safety. They circled the lodges with wagons, and Cannon ordered the Lakota to give up their weapons. The next dawn, they would begin the search. That night, the wind rose again. Star Woman, now among the hundreds encamped there, could see the orange flicker of campfires reflecting off the cannon barrels. Her son counted them 1, 2, 3, 4. She told him to stop to sleep, to dream of green grass. The terrain had chosen its trap. The low valley of Wounded Knee offered no escape, the hills on both sides too steep, the creek too narrow, the snow too deep. Even before the first shot of morning, history had already bent its path toward tragedy. The mistake, or the inevitability, was set into the ground itself. From this place, from this single encampment, surrounded by fear, the map of America would once again be redrawn, not by treaties, but by blood in the snow. December 29th, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek. At dawn, frost lay on the barrels of the soldiers' rifles like silver skin. The Lakota camp still slept, fires reduced to coals. Then came the command, "History has never heard the same way twice. Disarm them." From that instant onward, the story splits. Version 1, the official record. In the Army's report, Colonel James W. Forsyth described the event as a tragedy born of resistance. His dispatch to Major General Miles reads, "At approximately 8 a.m., while the Indians were being disarmed, one brave fired his weapon at the troops, and the command was compelled to return fire for its own preservation." The document continues in the dry cadence of bureaucracy counts of confiscated rifles, casualty lists, commendations for bravery. The tone suggests inevitability. The soldiers surrounded a camp of hostiles. One resisted. Chaos followed. The implication was order disrupted by savagery, discipline forced to defend itself. The Army's version became the telegram headlines. Within 48 hours, battle at Wounded Knee, 7th Cavalry victorious. Medals of honor were soon proposed. Washington congratulated Forsyth for his firm conduct under sudden provocation. In this narrative, geography and fear excused everything. The narrow valley, the tense cold, the single gunshot, all folded into an alibi written in official ink. Version 2, The Survivor's Memory. But the winter wind carried another account, quieter, spoken in Lakota, preserved in interviews decades later by the WPA and by the ethnographer Elaine Goodale Eastman, who arrived days after the shooting. They said the soldiers had already taken most of the weapons. The last search was for hidden knives and pipes. A deaf man, Black Coyote, did not understand the order to surrender his gun. He held it close. A trooper grabbed it. The rifle went off accidentally, the survivors insisted. A single misfire. Then the ring of guns around the camp erupted. Women ran with babies in their arms. Old men crawled into the creek bed. Bullets followed them. The Hotchkiss cannons fired downhill into the lodge's shells, exploding through teepee walls. When it ended, more than 250 Lakota lay dead or dying, nearly 2/3 of them women and children. One survivor, Wasumani, remembered the snow turning red and steaming in the sun. It was not a battle, she said. It was a slaughter. Between these two records lies the silence of the valley itself. The Army called it necessary action. The Lakota called it the day the song stopped. Both versions use the same sounds, the same crack of a rifle, the same echo across frozen ground, but they assign meaning differently. In one, that sound restores order. In the other, it ends a world. Why do they differ? Partly fear. No empire records its massacres as massacres. Partly language. The Army wrote in reports meant for superiors. The Lakota spoke in stories meant for descendants. And partly survival, each side writing the version it needed to keep breathing inside its own history. When General Miles later investigated his private letters, admitted unease. I have never known of a more unnecessary or cruel action. Yet the official citations remained. Medals were awarded. The battle stood on record for nearly a century. Even now the snow covers the slope where the creek bends, where the Hotchkiss shells landed. Archaeologists find fragments of shrapnel mixed with beads and bones, a mingling of two truths no report could reconcile. What happened at Wounded Knee depends on which language you hear it in. One translates order, the other grief. The distance between them is the space history calls denial. And in that silence between the telegraph lines and the drum beats, the question still waits. Whose word does the land believe? The smoke at Wounded Knee Creek did not lift for 3 days. When it finally cleared, the valley was silent, except for the sound of the wind scraping over canvas torn and half buried in snow. The soldiers called it mopping up. The Lakota who survived called it carrying the living out of the dead. December 30th, 1890, Pine Ridge Trail. Star Woman's husband lay somewhere behind her, lost in the confusion of gunfire. She had carried the children up from the creek bed when the first shells fell, ducking between wagon wheels, dragging a blanket already stiff with blood. Her daughter whimpered only once. After that, she did not make a sound. Now, as the wind turned bitter again, Star Woman joined the column of survivors forced toward the agency under military escort. The line stretched for miles, women wrapped in horsehide robes, old men limping beside travois, pulled by ponies whose hooves slipped on ice. The soldiers ahead rode with their rifles across their knees, steam rising from the horses like breath from exhausted ghosts. At each halt, the women scraped snow to find dry grass for fires. A few still carried kettles dented by bullets. From one pot came the smell of scorched corn rations found in the wreck of a supply wagon. A soldier shouted for silence, but the sound of the children coughing drowned him out. The valley behind them had already become a place of numbers. Reporters arriving from Chicago and Omaha wrote dispatches titled "Battle Ends Indian Uprising." They counted rifles recovered about 40. They counted dead 298. They did not count the wind or the way the frozen ground refused to accept another body. At the Pine Ridge Agency, tents were pitched for the wounded. Surgeon reports note severe frostbite among the Indian prisoners. One soldier's diary, Private Charles Loomis, adds a line that never reached print. There was a woman who kept singing though her hands were black from cold. The tune had no words I knew. She sang until her voice gave out. That woman might have been Star Woman. Her song came from habit, a rhythm older than pain. She tied rags around her daughter's feet, rubbed her son's hands with snow to keep the blood moving. Around her, other families did the same tiny gestures of survival inside the machinery of defeat. When food finally came, it arrived in tins stamped U.S. Army rations. Children tore at them with stones. The soup inside was half frozen, half salt. Still, they drank it like medicine. Each night, the sky above Pine Ridge pulsed with the glow of distant bonfires, where soldiers burned what remained of the ghost dance shirts, the cotton garments said to turn bullets aside. The Army called them superstition. To the Lakota, they were hope stitched by hand. Watching the flames, Star Woman whispered, "They burn what they cannot understand." Far from the camps, trains whistled across the prairie, carrying reporters, missionaries, and politicians. Washington demanded calm. General Miles demanded explanations. Colonel Forsyth was relieved of command, then reinstated weeks later. The telegraphs clattered with phrases like "regretful necessity order restored." But in the agency yard, there was no order, only cold. A young corporal recorded the temperature at -20. He noted that the Indians huddled close as if they fear the wind more than us. He never learned that the wind carried songs of mourning, songs forbidden, whispered into children's hair while soldiers stood guard with bayonets fixed. Then one morning in January, the sun came out with cruel brilliance. The snow turned blinding white. A detachment rode back toward Wounded Knee to bury the dead. Reporters followed, sketchbooks in hand. They found bodies frozen in the shapes of their last motion. A woman shielding a child, a man reaching for a drum. A horse collapsed mid-stride. They dug shallow trenches. The ground was too hard for graves. The official photographer, Traeger, arranged his camera on a tripod and asked soldiers to clear snow from the faces. The shutter clicked. The image would travel east under the caption, "View of the battlefield at Wounded Knee." But in the photograph, you can still see the small hand of a child, half buried in drift, the part no caption could name. Back at Pine Ridge, Star Woman's son became feverish. She traded a pair of earrings for willow bark tea from another camp. Her daughter's cough deepened. Each breath sounded like paper tearing. That night, the soldiers sang Christmas hymns around their fires. The Lakota mothers sang lullabies to the same rhythm. Two musics met in the wind and passed each other without recognition. When the fever broke, Star Woman looked east and thought of the hills she would never see again. The Black Hills. Her father's resting place were now closed by law-fenced claimed mind. The treaties that once named them sacred now named them federal property. She pressed her palm into the snow, leaving a print that melted slowly. "The land remembers," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Washington declared the Indian question settled. But in the agency camps, men buried small bundles of ashes at night, marking them with sticks carved in secret. The women began to weave new belts with patterns of broken lines to remember the interrupted songs. Each thread, each mark in the snow was a quiet defiance. Because even in captivity, people still adjusted saddles, still fed horses, still told stories around fires. The world had not ended, it had only changed its skin. And through it all, the wind never stopped. It carried the smell of gunpowder, the hum of telegraph lines, and somewhere within it, the faint, stubborn rhythm of the ghost dance. For those who survived, that rhythm was not rebellion anymore. It was heartbeat proof that the land was still listening. January 3rd, 1891. Pine Ridge Agency. The snow had crusted into armor. Even the wind seemed exhausted after so many days of carrying sorrow. Yet, under that stillness, something shifted, a slow realization, spreading through both camps. There would be no returning to the world that existed before Wounded Knee. The soldiers waited for orders that never came, staring at the frozen horizon. The Lakota waited for permission to grieve. Neither side knew what to do with the silence. But silence, too, can break. In the early hours of that morning, General Nelson A. Miles rode into the agency from his headquarters at Rapid City. His face was carved with fatigue. The reins in his hands were stiff with ice. He had read every report, the glowing headlines, the cold casualty lists, the letters from subordinates describing a necessary action. Now he wanted to see for himself. He dismounted, walked through the rows of tents, and saw what remained frostbitten children bodies wrapped in canvas, the survivors of Wounded Knee, huddled in the shadow of the same flag that had promised protection. His aide recorded his only words: "It was a massacre, nothing less." Those 4 words would never appear in official communiques, but they marked a rupture. For the Army, for Washington, for the myth of a nation that claimed civilization as its mission. Meanwhile, out in the hills west of the agency, Star Woman and others still uncounted lingered in the frozen draws. The Army patrols had swept the valleys, burning abandoned lodges, collecting whatever could be used as evidence. They called it pacification. For the Lakota, it meant choosing between surrender and starvation. Star Woman's group, barely 20 souls now, had built a lean shelter of willows and horsehide near Porcupine Creek. The creek itself ran under a lid of ice, its voice muffled but alive. They took turns breaking holes for water. Her son coughed less, but the girl's eyes had lost their light. Each night, she whispered to her children that they would return home when the soldiers left. Each morning, she looked toward the ridge and saw the plumes of Army campfires still burning. One dawn, a rider appeared, a messenger from Red Cloud's camp at Pine Ridge. He carried a small white cloth tied to a branch and a message: "General Miles offers peace. Bring the women and children in. You will be fed. You will be counted." It was not a promise, it was an end. The walk back took 2 days. The wind scraped their faces raw, but they kept moving, one line among hundreds, straggling toward the agency where the drums had gone quiet. They passed the wreckage of wagons, broken rifle stocks, bits of canvas half buried in snow. Each step through that landscape felt like walking across the pages of a torn treaty, fragments of words, pieces of lives, nothing whole. When they arrived, Miles stood waiting. His troops lined the perimeter, the 9th Cavalry, the 7th, and a company of Indian scouts who would rather have been anywhere else. Star Woman clutched her children close as she approached the cordon. The general raised his hand, signaling the soldiers to lower their rifles. He ordered food distributed. He ordered the wounded taken in. And then quietly, he told his staff to stop calling it a battle. That night, he sent a final dispatch to Washington. "The hostilities are over. There will be no more fighting, but it has cost more than war itself." It was the last line in his Wounded Knee file. After that, the record falls silent. The Lakota survivors were counted, photographed, and cataloged. Some were sent to boarding schools. Some were folded into new allotment rolls under the Dawes Act. The government declared the Sioux problem solved, but the cost was not in numbers. It was in the loss of a world's continuity. The language interrupted, the ceremonies outlawed, the land renamed. Star Woman was given a ration card, stamped Pine Ridge number 742. On the back, a printed rule read, "Recipients must remain within the reservation boundaries." She kept the card folded in her belt next to the small pouch of sage that had traveled with her since the first snow. Every night she unfolded it, stared at the seal of the United States, the eagle, the arrows, and thought of the old stories where eagles were messengers between the earth and sky. She wondered if this one still flew. By February, the thaw began. Snowmelt carried ash and fragments from the burned camps into White Clay Creek. Soldiers left the agency. Reporters moved on to newer stories. Silver Strike's rail expansions, another election. But among the Lakota, something irreversible had settled. They no longer spoke of treaties or return. They spoke, instead of remembrance, The ghost dance songs had ended in blood, but their rhythm lived in quiet gestures, in the way mothers taught children to greet the dawn, in the hidden words stitched into blankets, in the refusal to forget. The old world had closed its door, and none could force it open. Yet inside that closing, a seed remained small, stubborn, buried deep under snow. In an army notebook now kept at the National Archives, the final entry on the Wounded Knee campaign reads simply, "All operations concluded, area secured." But history did not conclude there. It merely went underground, into story, into silence, into song. Star Woman's voice was never written down, but in 1938, her granddaughter was interviewed by a Works Progress Administration field worker. She said, "My grandmother told me the snow remembers. When the wind comes from the south, you can still hear the dance in it." That single line, "the snow remembers," is where the official record ends and the human record begins. And so the point of no return was not just a day of violence. It was the moment the Lakota ceased to be subjects of treaties and became keepers of memory. The page turned, the ink froze, the paper tore, and history was forced to continue in voices that could not be silenced. For the United States, it was closure. For the Lakota, it was survival rewritten in song. Spring 1891. Pine Ridge Agency. The snow finally melted, but the land did not heal. Beneath the thaw lay cartridges, torn moccasins, pieces of iron from Hotchkiss shells. The Army called the area secured territory. The Lakota called it a place of ghosts. Within weeks, the survivors were counted again. 363 individuals entered into new agency roles. Each received an allotment number, a ration card, and a place within boundaries drawn by others. The Great Sioux Reservation, once a vast expanse of over 60 million acres, had been fractured into smaller reservations. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, and Lower Brule. Together, they totaled barely 1/4 of the land promised into the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. 1 year later, in 1891, the U.S. Congress ratified additional land cessions. Gold miners legally entered the Black Hills. Rail lines cut through valleys once reserved for hunting and ceremony. Towns like Deadwood and Lead grew fat on the veins of ore that had cost so many lives to protect. To Washington, it was progress. To the Lakota, it was the final silence of their sacred hills. At Pine Ridge, General Miles ordered the construction of a model Indian school. It opened in 1893 under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, English-only instruction, military drills, and haircuts for every child. By 1895, over half the Lakota children were enrolled. Their Lakota names erased, replaced by names drawn from the Bible and the Registry of American Presidents. One report proudly stated, "They have forgotten their tribal ways." But forgetting was never complete. Star Woman's son listed as Samuel I. Feather attended that school. His teachers noted he was quiet, obedient, good at drawing maps. No one knew he was sketching the outlines of rivers his mother had described to him, the ones beyond the agency fences. 5 years after Wounded Knee, the Dawes Act reached full enforcement. Land not individually allotted was declared surplus and sold to settlers. Nearly 9 million additional acres of Sioux territory vanished. The checkerboard pattern of ownership spread like a disease. By 1900, white ranchers grazed cattle on the same grass where the ghost dancers had prayed for the return of buffalo. In the official photographs of that decade, the Lakota appear in suits and dresses lined up before mission churches. The captions say civilized. But behind each image lay a quieter truth: the songs had not died. They had gone underground. Elders whispered them during births and funerals. Beadwork designs encoded memories of rivers, treaties, ancestors' history carried not in books, but in patterns. 20 years later, 1910, the Black Hills mines produced over $100 million in gold. The Bureau of Indian Affairs reported that Pine Ridge had the highest poverty rate of all reservations. Hunger remained a season, not an emergency. Star Woman did not live to see that year. Her son, now a man, was conscripted during World War I, sent to France with the 91st Infantry Division. He fought under a flag that had once flown above the Wounded Knee Valley. In a letter home, he wrote only one line: "The earth smells the same when it's wet even far from home." That letter survived. It rests today in a box at the South Dakota State Historical Society, the last known trace of a family once counted under Pine Ridge number 742. In the long arc of the 20th century, the map kept shifting, but the wound never closed. The Supreme Court would later rule in 1980 that the Black Hills had been taken illegally. The U.S. offered $105 million in compensation. The Lakota refused it. The Black Hills are not for sale. And so, a century after the snow turned red, the land still holds the memory of both the treaty and the betrayal. The aftermath of Wounded Knee was not merely territorial, it was spiritual cartography. The borders changed, but the ground beneath them did not forget. Every renamed town, every mined ridge, every fenced meadow remains haunted by what was promised and then broken. The map on paper was new, but the land, the true land, still spoke the old names beneath the wind. Today, if you stand at Wounded Knee Creek before sunrise, the land seems impossibly quiet. The frost lies over the grass like thin glass. The wind drifts low through the cottonwoods. There is no monument large enough to name what happened here, only a small fenced cemetery, a wooden cross. And the names that time refused to erase: Bigfoot, White Bird, Yellow Robe, One Feather. Every December, Lakota families return. They light sage and place tobacco bundles at the graves. The ceremony is simple: a drumbeat, a song carried by 2 or 3 voices, the rhythm steady as breathing. It is not a reenactment, not mourning performed for history. It is continuity, the living, acknowledging the land that holds their dead. Nearby, a new generation of riders gathers for the Bigfoot Memorial Ride, tracing the same 300-mile winter route from the Cheyenne River to Pine Ridge. They begin each December in snow, wrapped in star quilts, carrying staffs painted with eagle feathers. For 2 weeks, they ride across the plains, not as protest, but as pilgrimage. Each hoofbeat a heartbeat of endurance. One rider said, "We ride so the ground will remember our names." Across the reservations, the work of remembrance continues in quieter forms. The Lakota Language Consortium records elders speaking words nearly lost, names of rivers, plants, winds. In classrooms once used for assimilation, children now learn to say Pahasapa instead of Black Hills. The language re-enters the air, as if the land had been waiting to hear itself again. In archives and museums, the artifacts of 1890, a ghost dance dress. A beaded belt, the fragments of a drum, are now treated not as relics, but as correspondences. Each object is a letter from one century to another. Scholars speak less of closure now, more of listening. They study the oral histories alongside military reports, not to decide which is true, but to understand how truth survives when written language fails. At Pine Ridge, on a ridge that overlooks the old agency grounds, a single cottonwood grows. Locals call it the witness tree. During storms, lightning often strikes nearby, but the tree still stands scarred, bent alive. It has become a quiet symbol of what the Lakota call wawaching thanka, steadfastness, the courage of persistence. A century and more has passed since the treaties broke and the snow turned red. Yet, the echoes remain in songs sung to children at night, in the old names spoken softly into the wind, in the riders who cross the frozen plains each winter. History wrote its ending in reports and telegrams. The people who endured it continue to write in breath, in movement, in memory. The land keeps both versions, and when the wind moves through the Black Hills, it carries the faint rhythm of the ghost dance, not a call to war, but a reminder the earth still remembers who once listened to it. The snow has melted, but the echoes remain. Every time the wind crosses the Black Hills, it carries the rhythm of a song once forbidden. Maybe history isn't finished. Maybe it's still asking us to listen. Tell me in the comments, what do you think the land remembers most? The battles? Or the prayers that came after?